Now, when you think of how God speaks to you, now what's the first thing that comes to mind? Okay, for me, it's in that movie Bruce Almighty with Morgan Freeman when he talks in a very deep, serious, direct voice. Okay, jokes aside, that's not how God speaks to me, and that's not how he has actually ever spoken to me before. It is key to really make space and pay attention to how God speaks to you in order to walk by the Spirit and not by the flesh. Now, we all go through really challenging times in our lives. And so it's key to be hearing from God of how he specifically speaks to you, how he encourages you to keep going down on your path. Now, in this video, I'm going to share the different ways that God speaks to you. And I'm also going to share a couple different factors that can get in the way of hearing God's voice clearly. Now, Christians can go years without hearing God's voice, or at least they perceive it that way. Now, why do you think that is? Well, one reason could be lack of intimacy with Jesus, or they're just not open to the Holy Spirit. They're completely closed off. Another would be that they're not fully surrendered to Jesus. See, Jesus must sanctify us. He must wash us. And right before Jesus' crucifixion, when he was washing disciples' feet, in John 13:8, he talks about that, saying that he must wash them or they have no part with him. Romans 8:6 says, "The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace." Now, one thing I've noticed in my own life is that when my mind is governed by the flesh, that comes with a lot of anxiety and confusion. But when I'm led by the Spirit, that comes with peace, joy, and confidence as well. Now, when the mind is governed by the flesh, I have a lot of anxiety, and it's actually very difficult for me to hear from God clearly. Now, a lot of times people are not even aware of how they're speaking, how God's speaking, and they're confused that he's even speaking at all. So why is it so crucial to hear God speak to uniquely you? Well, the first is because he speaks in a way that you receive best. The second is he knows how you're made, and he uniquely sees you. The third is his voice roots you in identity in him. And the fourth is, like I've mentioned before, we all go through dark times, storms in our lives, and we need to hear from him in order for us to give the strength to keep going. Now, in Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, Pete Scazzero talks about this. He says a mature spirituality requires that you go through the pain of the wall, or as the ancients call it, the dark night of the soul. Just as a physical wall stops you from moving ahead, God sometimes stops us in our spiritual journey through a spiritual wall in order to radically transform our character. Often we're brought to the wall by circumstances and crises that are actually beyond our control. In Isaiah 45:3, it talks about God going right before us, giving us treasures of the darkness. "I will go before you, and I will level the mountains. I will break down gates of bronze, and I will cut through bars of iron. I will give you the hidden treasures, riches stored in the secret place, so that you may know that I am the Lord, the God of Israel, who summons you by name." I want to share a personal story with you. So I grew up in a church culture that said in order for women to be considered good Christians, that they must be passive. The underlying message that was taught was that women were to be seen and not heard. So for so long growing up in this culture, I thought God must have made a mistake on me. I was so confused because naturally I've always had this loud voice since a child. I've always had opinions, and I've always been one to speak up and want to share my opinions with others. So why is that? And for so long I thought, does my Creator not accept me? And should I lessen my voice in order to be more accepted in this church culture? I heard 1,000 times growing up in church who they said God was and what God said about me. But it wasn't until those painfully dark times where I was in my room alone, speaking out, crying out to God, that I heard his voice speak to me so specifically saying, "No, Adelaide, you were not a mistake. You're here for a purpose. Your voice is important, and I have plans for you." Now, after hearing all this content, you're probably thinking, well, this is all great, Adelaide, but what are some different ways that God speaks to us? One thing I suggest is picking up the book God's Secrets by Shawn Bolz. It's an excellent book that goes into this. Shawn Bolz talks about 6 different ways that God speaks to us. Now, the first way that God speaks to us is through dreams. So that's when we dream at night. The second is through trances, and that's heightened spiritual awareness. The third is through visions, such as visionary experiences. The fourth is flashbacks, similar to deja vu. The fifth would be when we hear his direct voice, so a voice that's clearly not our own. And then the last is impressions, when he downloads an impression within us and gives us a mental picture or an image within us. Now, I want to share another story with you guys. It was about a few years ago, and I was experiencing some severe anxiety. I'm talking anxiety that would would loom on for weeks and months at times. I could not shake it. I tried everything from exercising. I worked out so hard in the gym. I did CBD. I did partying. I watched TV and movies. I worked so hard on my business to try to distract myself, but none of this helped, gave me little to no relief. And believe it or not, the only thing that gave me relief was when I made space. I went into my room, I shut the door, and I cried out and I surrendered to God. And it was in those moments that I heard him speak so clearly to me, that he was giving me all these great revelations of who he was and who I was, and that this was only a season and it was not going to last forever. Hearing his voice helped me develop even stronger trust in him and his ultimate leadership for my life. So now, what are some different ways that actually keeps you from hearing from God's voice? The first would be not making enough space. The second would be misplaced identity. The third would be pain that creates a guarded heart against God. Now, the fourth is an offended heart. And in an offended heart, I understand there's a lot to talk about on this topic. So in future videos, I'll definitely go more into depth. And the final would be that the enemy's voice is actually much louder than God's voice. See, a lot of times we think that God is either checked out or he's just not present or doesn't care. So we go through a lot of confusion. But here's the good news. This I promise you, God is not a God of confusion. He's ever more present now, and he wants to speak to uniquely you and speak in a way that you receive best. Now, before you move on to the next video, I suggest that you take some time and do this exercise. Go ahead, grab a journal and a pen, and we're going to have a moment of silence. And in that silence, ask God how he uniquely sees you.